Welcoming those who are joining us for this quarter's ESG quarter. Just welcome you into the room. And we will then kick off. All right. So let us start. Hello and welcome to this quarter's ESG quarter, brought to you by the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. My name is Andrew Peterson and I am the CEO of BCSD Australia. In opening, let me acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you today from the land of the Camaragal people, and we acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. So the agenda will be a quick global quarter roundup by my good self, and then we will hear from our expert panel. Firstly, from Murray Griffin, founder and CEO of Earth.au. Then, fingers crossed, we will be joined also by Alona Miller, partner at Gilbert and Tobin. And who's there? There's the raised hand, you can tell. Hello and welcome, Alona. And with that, we will also promote her to panelist. And we will also then hear from Karen Williams from the Chartered Accountants Australia New Zealand and Tim Buckley from Climate Energy Finance, rounding out our expert panel. And then we will have a chat with Emma Dawson from Per Capita. But first, let's do the quarterly roundup and let's go around the world awfully quickly in finding out what's been going on. So at a global level, the Deutsche Bank and one of its executives made an interesting insight in relation to this question of ESG backlash and looking at whether or not the backlash is in fact starting to lose its bite. And the argument that the executive was raised in this very interesting article that we've been sharing with our members is that the wave of anti-ESG sentiment that's being fueled is actually seeing a global retreat from the investing strategy and is now showing some considerable signs of losing steam. So, yeah, interesting thought. This executive says that the development follows adjustments to the regulations in the global north, with investors increasingly able to target a wide array of sectors, and specifically called out fossil fuel assets that were once deemed off bounds now for climate investors could actually be starting to be found within so-called transition strategies as regulators across Europe, which is considered to be to date the world's largest ESG market, reworking existing rules. And we'll no doubt talk about that more in the minutes following. We saw that the IFRS launched the guide for companies to voluntarily apply ISSB sustainability reporting standards. And then we moved on to an interesting new report from Oil Change International and Zero Carbon Analytics that actually looked at the number of climate-related lawsuits in the last year. And in fact, in terms of an annual number, has found that those lawsuits against the world's largest fossil fuel producing companies has nearly tripled since the making of the Paris Agreement and its adoption in 2015. Now, looking at and breaking down this report, the lawsuits actually cover compensation for climate-related damages, greenwashing, or false advertising allegations, and the complaints about companies' failure to set and implement reduction plans. That's the context of the lawsuits that they were looking at. They found that several lawsuits have centred around allegations of greenwashing or misleading misleading advertising rather. But despite the increase in these findings, no oil or gas company has to date paid any liability for damages associated with climate change. Then I think it was only a few weeks ago that RepRisk reported that the number of companies that actually linked to greenwashing or misleading claims about environmental impact of both operation and product, they actually fell for the first time in 6 years as regulatory and stakeholder pressure has come on board. So the report also found that nearly 1/3 of companies were flagged for greenwashing in the previous year, were now found to be engaging in exactly the same practice in 2024. And when it came to the sectors of concern, again, looking at the earlier arguments or earlier news information, that the oil and gas industry is already accounted for most of greenwashing incidents reported, followed then by the food and beverage sector, and then banking and financial services. And in terms of geography, Europe and North America, perhaps unsurprisingly, were reported as having the highest levels of greenwashing incidents. One that tickled my fancy was this piece by Trellis, which a number of you may know as the former GreenBiz website. It reported that there was this new role that was coming forward in companies called the ESG controller. And companies were now looking for this skill set and this role and description within their particular companies due to these mandatory ESG reporting regulations. And the candidates themselves have to have a sort of a real potpourri of qualifications. Whether it's previous audit experience, knowledge of ESG reporting standards, understanding of ESG regulations, and in some cases, they also had to have a CPA license. So interesting to see the market moving. In terms of Canada, Canadian NGOs have been criticising Canada's new sustainability finance rules, arguing that they don't actually go far enough in decarbonising and actually leave the door open to gas being a key player within the rules themselves. The NGOs have been highlighting the inadequacy of the new financial rules, particularly in relation to the inclusion of natural gas in the taxonomy, and they emphasise the need for a committed follow-through to ensure the credibility of the labelling rules and the inclusion of civil society representatives, climate experts, and Indigenous rights holders were included in the decision-making process. So this will be an interesting one to observe in contrast to and perhaps comparable with the work that's being undertaken by ASFI, the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute in Australia, with the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy in Australia coming to fruition very soon. Two more countries to focus on. The United Kingdom. The United Kingdom government has announced that they are moving forward with plans to regulate ESG rating agencies, aiming to increase transparency and prevent greenwashing. And this is expected to be delivered in the latter half of 2025. Then we move to the United States, and it's some interesting insights over the last quarter. The first is a piece by the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, which looked at the US sustainability reports of 2024 thus far released, and looked at the trends and the statistics that came through from those reports. A couple of insights. The first is there is a shift back to sustainability from ESG in report titles. And we went the other way for a while, and now we're going back the other way again. The increase in report length is an interesting manifestation. We sought to decrease. Now we're trying to put perhaps more back into the reports themselves to give greater integrity and certainly more detail. The rise of double materiality assessments is manifest in, interestingly, US sustainability reports, as well as the CEO accountability for ESG strategies. Again, one to look out for in other jurisdictions going forward. The one that surprised me the most, though, was this inclusion of DEI themes within these sustainability reports, despite the arguments that DEI is, in fact, something that's being argued should not be in US business performance, let alone action and reporting in relation to DEI. So it's interesting to see that this report actually bucked that particular notion. And the last was the mentioning of the emergence of new disclosure frameworks and the increasing focus on responsible AI, key issues that are going on here in Australia as well. A couple of interesting other data points. JP Morgan's global head of sustainable solutions claimed, I think in August, that the impact of political backlash against ESG issues in the US was being overstated, a comment that we hearkened earlier from Deutsche Bank, and that it wasn't actually significantly affecting the US's green economy. And this is despite some companies and investors saying less about sustainability Chuka Umanu was actually saying that they're still investing at very similar levels to their European peers. We then had a report out from PricewaterhouseCoopers on the annual Corporate Directors Survey, looking at what were the attitudes coming through from that cohort that they report on a regular basis. Interestingly, in that, corporate boards have been seeing a declining focus on ESG issues. So is there something going on between boards as distinct from senior management? Slightly less than half of these companies, or these boards rather, were looking at ESG as part of their regular agenda, not as many as we perhaps first thought, and that the directors were reporting ambiguity in the meaning of ESG. Perhaps there's something they need to understand as distinct from the board itself, with many viewing it as a charged term, and that less than 1 in 10 were agreeing that ESG meant the same thing as sustainability. Harks back to something we highlighted earlier. In the case of the Sustainable Investments Institute, there was a report out that identifies over 100 anti-ESG shareholder proposals were actually filed in 2024. That's 2024 to date, with only 81 that were going to vote as at the 30th of June. Now, the support for these proposals averaged just 1.9%, which is actually less than half of what they received 3 years ago. So there's some interesting confusion going on, and certainly lumpiness in relation to the importance of ESG from a shareholder and risk point of view. And then finally, and perhaps one that we've all heard, is that the US Securities and Exchange Commission has actually announced it's disbanding its climate and ESG enforcement task force after more than 3 years. The argument's been that the task force was formed to address greenwashing as an emerging risk, but that the SEC will now use the enforcement strategies that it's learned from the last 3 years to hold future companies accountable to see if any other further risk arises. Well, that's the global look. Let's now jump to and hear from Murray Griffin from earth.au. Murray, give us a sense of what you're seeing, hearing, and reporting in ESG Snapshot. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. I appreciate it. And greetings from Bunurong country near Phillip Island in Victoria. I wanted to talk about 3 things. Firstly, in various jurisdictions, we're starting to see concrete signs of action to streamline approval processes for clean economy and large-scale renewables projects. In Victoria, the state government recently announced that it had granted a planning permit for the first project to be entirely assessed under its new fast-track development facilitation program for big renewables. And since that first one, 2 other Victorian projects have since received permits under the same fast-track assessment process. In Tasmania, the government has announced the first 2 projects that will be assessed under its streamlined new renewable energy approvals pathway, known as REAP. And in South Australia, the public comment period has recently ended on a draft state development coordination and facilitation bill, which is designed to ensure the regulatory and planning system in the state is fit for purpose for the net zero transition. The bill provides for state development areas, or SDAs, that would be proactively assessed by regulators as environmentally and economically suitable for key developments. And these SDAs could take the form of infrastructure corridors, green manufacturing hubs, port industrial zones, or common user infrastructure areas. The South Australian bill will also establish a one-stop shop state government assessment and approvals pathway for major and complex projects. Meanwhile, at the federal level, public comment has just closed on Treasury's proposed new front door system for major transformational investments. And that process could coordinate engagement with relevant agencies, not just approval agencies, but also funding bodies. Secondly, I wanted to briefly note some of the new parliamentary inquiries that have popped up federally and in New South Wales since we had our last quarterly briefing. In New South Wales, a parliamentary inquiry into the state government's biodiversity offset scheme reform bill reported last week after being established a month or so back. The report notes that overall, most stakeholders support the intentions of the bill. But interestingly, the New South Wales Committee kind of squibs it and doesn't make any recommendations other than that the bill be debated and that the concerns that were raised in the inquiry be addressed during debate in the House. The New South Wales report on a nature bill came out just a couple of weeks after a Senate committee released its report into Minister Plibersek's nature positive bill. And that committee also struggled to reach anything remotely approaching a solid consensus. In that federal committee, Greens senators played their cards close to their chest and just said they wanted stronger reforms without making explicit recommendations. In contrast, the various other crossbench committee members basically put forward a pepper spray of diverse recommendations. And I think these two reports, one federal and one from New South Wales, both of them somewhat directionless, highlight that it's particularly difficult to reach a consensus on nature legislation at the moment. The reason for that, I don't know, people will all have their own theories. Mine is that we're having to make such a giant leap with this round of nature legislative reform because there's widespread recognition that our current nature protection legislation is in particularly bad shape. In other committee inquiry news, last month the Senate established a select committee on energy planning and regulation that will inquire into the regulation and operation of the Australian energy market. Federally, there is also a new joint select committee inquiry into energy, food and water security in Northern Australia. And the Senate has also instigated a committee inquiry into the offshore wind consultation process, with a report due by the end of February. Finally, on the new federal inquiries front, the government has instigated a new inquiry into nuclear energy, which will look at issues including costs and timeframes, and that will report before the next federal election. And I think we can all be confident that that one will be a real page turner. Meanwhile, back in New South Wales, State Parliament has launched an inquiry into the impact of renewable energy zones on rural and regional communities and industry. The inquiry will also examine matters including compensation, fire risk, alternatives to large-scale wind and solar, and community consultation. The third and last thing I wanted to touch on is the upcoming COP29 climate talks in Azerbaijan. I wanted to highlight the particularly strong role that Australia and other countries in this region will be playing at COP29. Most importantly, Australia's Climate Minister, Chris Bowen, will have a key role as one of two ministers who will assist the COP presidency in finalising negotiations on a new international goal for raising climate finance. Now, this new goal will update the 100 billion a year global goal that was set in 2009, and negotiating it is basically the headline issue at the COP, and it will be a very significant role for Minister Bowen. One of the other most important issues up for discussion at COP29 is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which deals with international cooperation, mainly through market mechanisms. And two ministers in our region will lead ministerial level discussions on Article 6. Singapore's Environment Minister, Grace Fu, and Singapore is one of the leaders, basically, in implementing Article 6 frameworks. And the other one is New Zealand. The other co-chair, ministerial co-chair, will be New Zealand's Climate Change Minister, Simon Watt. Firstly, just two more things, if I can, Andrew, on COP29. Firstly, I will be there in part thanks to a generous sponsorship from BCSDA. Thanks very much to the BCSDA board for that. So if anyone tuning in is going to be there, please get in touch so we can arrange to meet up. And second, yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is that I've also launched a new podcast called Track Changes. And for people who are interested in COP29 and sustainable development, sustainability, diplomacy at the international level generally, I highly recommend that you tune in for the first episode, which will be coming out tomorrow or Wednesday, which will be an interview with Susan Brown, who's just been appointed Assistant Secretary General for the UN Development Programme. And she's got some fascinating insights into international sustainability diplomacy. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for that. Never a dull moment in the Murray Griffin world, and excited that you are flying the BCSD flag in
Thank you.
downtown Baku. Now let's move into the policy and regulatory world, or legal policy, law and policy world, and jump over to RSRC. I didn't know she changed her name, but I knew her as the former artist of Ilona Miller, and welcome her to give her quick summation of what's going on in the law and policy world on ESG. Over to you, RSRC.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's the joys of meeting room names rather than personalising from my laptop. But I think Murray's sort of provides a great segue into what I was going to sort of start with, which was kind of that look forward into the regulatory and policy developments that are taking place over the next few months in the international sphere. We're moving into COP season. Murray's mentioned COP29 for climate, but we actually have meetings of all three of the Rio Conventions taking place in the next 2 months. And also the fifth session of the International Negotiating Committee for the Plastics Treaty. So in terms of kind of what I'm going to be looking at and tracking across those COP meetings, first up, we've got COP16, the Biodiversity COP, which will be held in Colombia starting on the 21st of this month. And what's happening there is that tracking of progress against the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed 2 years ago. One of the key sort of elements of that is to see whether countries have, in fact, prepared their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and how they're tracking against progress for those action plans. And that's basically looking at how are they translating and implementing the 23 different goals that were set in the Kunming-Montreal framework. So Australia has, in fact, updated its biodiversity strategy and produced a strategy for nature 2024 to 2030 just recently. And that sort of sits quite well alongside the Global Nature Positive Summit, which was held here in Sydney last week. But a couple of other key themes to watch in the biodiversity negotiations will also be the implementation and mobilisation of finance. We have a target under the biodiversity framework to achieve $20 billion a year per year by 2025 of public finance for biodiversity. Reality is I think we're still falling well short of that, but we'll be sort of closely tracking progress on that front. There's also looking at the mechanism to equitably share what's called digital sequence information on genetic resources. So this is quite an important work program looking at how we track biodiversity and genetic information. And there'll also be work done on the work program that looks at traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So a couple of those key elements of the Biodiversity Convention that are being progressed. So there are a couple of key things to look for out of COP16. Murray's mentioned a couple of the key issues that he'll be tracking at COP29. Basically, the presidency themes for COP29 are enabling action and enhancing ambition. On the enabling component, that's really looking at that scaling up of climate finance and the new quantified global goal. And, there's been a whole process in the lead up to setting that goal, lots of submissions from parties on what it should look like. But I mean, ultimately, it will come down to a fine balance of, what is, needed from a scientific and quantitative perspective and what is politically feasible and acceptable amongst the parties. Just by way of example, you've got the Africa group saying that that goal needs to scale from $100 billion a year to 1.3 trillion. I think everyone else is somewhere in between. Murray mentioned carbon markets and operationalising Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. That is a presidency priority to get that finalised so that not just so that the new mechanism under Article 6.4 can start to come into play, but also so that there can be more certainty for countries that are participating in the cooperative mechanism under Article 6.2. Quite interesting in respect of Article 6 was a pretty gutsy move made by the Joint Supervisory Committee for the Article 6.4 mechanism, where they've actually adopted some guidelines with respect to the implementation of various aspects of Article 6 in advance of the COP meeting. So they've just said, yep, we're adopting these processes, which hopefully means that the actual they won't be opened up for debate during the COP meeting, which was one of the things that recommendations that were made last year just fell over because they were sort of unfinalised. Another key element sort of in that finance and enabling action space is operationalising the loss and damage fund, which was agreed to last year. And then the other areas that are going to be particularly interesting to watch around the ambition is that we're coming up to the time for countries to submit their enhanced and new nationally determined contributions. They're due by February next year, but the presidency is really pushing for countries to come early and to sort of really come forward with their enhanced NDCs. This also feeds in with the progress around the sort of submission of biannual transparency reports. And we'll also have a debate, as we did last year in Dubai, around the phase out of fossil fuels in line with the Paris Agreement and the global stock take. So there's going to be a lot to watch at COP29. We also have the COP16 for the UNCCD, which is the Convention to Combat Desertification. People don't often sort of talk about this. It's the sort of poor cousin of climate and biodiversity. But it's quite interesting just having a look at what's on the agenda there, because I think the focus of the CCD is how do you improve drought resilience, how do you reduce land degradation, how do you invest and promote land restoration efforts. And at the previous COP, there was a commitment to accelerate the restoration of 1 billion hectares of degraded land by 2030, and also improve data collection in respect of degraded lands and restoration. These things are very much still on the agenda, and I think when you think about where we sit within Australia, we've been lucky with a couple of very wet sort of La Nina years, but we will be coming into a new drought cycle, no doubt, in the next year or two. And so thinking about the means by which we actually put in place policy frameworks to address drought and manage resilience and desertification is really, really key. And then the last area at an international level is the INC 5 meetings on the plastics treaty. This is sort of the last meeting before we kind of get a red light or a green light in terms of moving forward with countries internationally adopting a global plastics treaty. So these negotiations will be really, really intense and really important. We've had signals from the Biden-Harris administration that they're supportive of moving forward with a global plastics treaty. But as with all of the initiatives and progress in this sort of multilateral space, what happens in the US election is going to be absolutely critical. And so I think that's going to be certainly one thing to watch. But I guess just drawing out from the key themes across all of those treaties and work programs, I think the first thing is that across all of them, there's a need to rapidly sort of scale the finance and investment. We need trillions for climate finance. We need billions for biodiversity finance. And so talking about that aspect of where is the money coming from and how do we balance public and private finance is going to be key. We've also got the importance of integration of strategies because of the interconnected nature of these elements. So across each of those Rio conventions, there are work streams talking about collaboration and cohesion. And so, as we well know, in order to address global warming, we have to be nature positive and addressing nature restoration to manage plastics pollution. We're also looking at strategies around global warming and management of environment and marine sort of protection. So that integration is key. Another key theme is equitable transitions and the need to involve local communities and Indigenous peoples across all of these areas. And that was a very strong theme that also came out of the Global Nature Positive Summit last week. And I think something that I expect Karen will pick up on in her remarks is the expectation to enhance sort of the approaches around disclosure. And I think across climate, across nature and biodiversity, in order to meet our transparency obligations, we are going to sort of be seeing that integration with the global reporting frameworks and the disclosure frameworks that are under development. So that's sort of my take on what to look for in the global COP market. I did have some broader observations around sort of just the local parliamentary processes that we've seen over the last sort of couple of months, but happy to come back to those a little bit later if we want to talk a bit more about Future Made in Australia, sort of my take on the nature positive legislation, which I think Murray's also touched on. And the one that I think is really, really important over the last little while is actually the framework that's been implemented through the Net Zero Economy Agency legislation, which passed as well. But I'll leave it there and throw across to, I think it's Karen next.
It is indeed for accountability and reporting and standards update, which, nothing much happened during the last quarter. Did it, Karen?
No, actually, I'm actually shocked that I'm going to be the person to mention that climate disclosures are mandatory now. That bill did actually get through and has received royal assent. So that was obviously a big shift, and everyone, even whilst it sort of passed through the upper house, but actually a lot of people missed the fact that it had to go back to the lower house because of the amendments. And so it wasn't, although it was a fairly much of a formality, we still had to wait an extra few weeks for that to happen. But the legislation has passed. I think it got royal assent on about the Tuesday. Friday, the Australian Accounting Standards Board met and they have issued the standards, they balloted the standards, and they are now we're sort of another 3 weeks or so on from that. They are now on their website and available for everyone to use. So they have issued the equivalent of IFRS S1, but they're now calling it AASB S1. That is being issued in a voluntary capacity and is effectively almost identical to S1. There are no changes really, apart from fundamental ones in terms of referencing the Australian market. They have also issued AASB S2, which is very similar to IFRS S2, which is the mandatory climate disclosures bill. So that is going to be mandatory standard. The key difference to the international standard for this one is that they are not making industry metrics mandatory in Australia at this time. So those are not included in the Australian equivalent of the standard. That's not to say that won't be part of it in the future, because I think it has been certainly indicated through the explanatory memorandum that industry metrics are something that are expected to come, but they are being deferred while the AASB, I guess, look at the international industry metrics and look at how they can be Australianised for the local market. So that is more of a work in progress. So that is the key difference from the international standards and the Australian ones. So now everything turns to, I guess, implementation. So ASIC also were hot off the mark as soon as the royal assent. And so there's now a few web pages, if you haven't checked them out, that explain to you sustainability reporting, who's going to have to do it, that it's climate only, but don't get confused by the fact that everything refers to sustainability reporting, because that's how the legislation has been worded, but it is still only climate at this stage. ASIC are expected to consult from November on their regulatory guidance in relation to the regime and how they will take that forward. And actually, applications for relief are already open. So they're already asking for, or not so much, but entities who want relief can go to them, and there's information on their website around that. Just building on, I guess, the standard side, the IFRS, if you are interested, I guess they have a series of webinars out that they're working their way through for implementation. So they've done one recently, and I'm just going to see if I can get up the thing so I don't forget. The current one that's coming up this week, which is at a horrible time for Australia, is on implementation and insights from Africa, but there was a value of industry-based disclosures and getting started, and those are all available on their website to watch on demand, which is far more sociable from an Australian perspective. And there'll be a number of other ones coming as well. In fact, one coming up is going to be on the transition from TCFD to IFRS. So some fairly useful ones. They're also working on guidance, so we should see some more information from them around things like materiality, proportionality, so applying for different sized entities, and scenario analysis. So there's certainly quite a few bits of resources coming, and also the opportunity, I guess, for the AASB now to work out where those gaps are for them. Just as an interest across the ditch in New Zealand, the External Reporting Board there is just consulting on some additional transitional measures for their reporting regime. So those who are not aware, New Zealand is just basically going through its first year of reporting at the moment. So we're seeing those first wave of reports come out. So before the second year reports come, the External Reporting Board, or XRB, there is consulting on effectively extending some of their transition guidance that they had in place. So, for example, Scope 3 emissions were to be reported in the second year. They're now offering that to be reported in the third year. Assurance of greenhouse gas emissions was supposed to be for all scopes in year 2. You have the ability for Scope 3 emissions, even if you decide to report it in year 2, you can defer the assurance of it to year 3. So there are a few of those being considered, and that's possibly, for those who are interested, it gives you a bit of an idea on how the New Zealand regime is being implemented and some of the challenges, because I think it's highly likely that we're going to see some of the same types of challenges within the Australian market as we seek to do this. Obviously, Alona's touched a bit, and others have touched on the Global Nature Positive Summit. I think a sort of key thing for me coming out of that was how do we don't value enough our existing nature assets, and that there's all this focus on nature positive and nature repair, but actually on not actually retaining what we've got, and actually how do we protect that, and how do we ensure that it has a suitable value to a business so that it doesn't get destroyed thinking, oh, it can be repaired at a later stage, which actually is not really equivalent, and different people are paying those costs. And I think that was probably, looking at my list, that was most of the bits. Oh, I think just on the disclosure space, and I guess as we're looking at the global biodiversity framework and obviously coming out, we've seen with the TNFD, and we had obviously Tony Goldler in the country last week talking about that. We've now got 22, I think, Australian companies piloting the TNFD. 23, sorry, 23, okay. Sorry for the one I missed. Do we have 23? But there's also been quite a bit of talk around, will TNFD be mandatory, and so forth. I've certainly heard the minister speak a few times, and I think her indication is it's not an immediate plan, as in not in the next couple of years, to mandate something like nature. Now, that is part of the global diversity target 15, and that's by 2030. So I think what we are likely to see is probably the government looking to what the IFRS Foundation does in relation to the ISSB and their next two standards, which will be, one will be the biodiversity ecosystems and ecosystem services, and one will be on human capital. And I think we'll start to see, as those start to come to fruition, and also the fact that we have S1 in a voluntary capacity already, I think that's going to be the solution to how do we broaden corporate reporting, is actually we need to be looking at S1 more fully, and perhaps encouraging that adoption in a voluntary sense over the next few years, before we're in a position to actually look at, do we make that sort of mandatory? But obviously it is very much on the horizon, and leading companies are certainly leading in that space. Thanks, Andrew.
Fantastic roundup. Thank you, Karen. So much happened in the last quarter. I'm amazed you could condense it into the type package that you did. Let's jump now to the big question of economics and energy, and bring in Tim. Again, very quiet quarter when it comes to geopolitical conflict and the impact it has on energy, and concerns in relation to China's growth, and then not concerns in relation to China growth, and then big discussions, as Alona highlighted, about the pathway in relation to investable NDCs. What's been on your landscape over the last quarter in relation to energy?
Thanks, Andrew. Whenever we're talking about the global energy system transformation, in my mind, we've got to start with China. And maybe picking up, Andrew, your comment about the Chinese economy, my view is that the concerns over the Chinese economy's recession are dramatically overstated. And I'll use a partial indicator that I track, and that is electricity demand. In the month of August, the electricity demand in China was up 8% year on year. Year to date, it was up 7%. So I look at that and go, well, hang on, for all of the massive fears that China's property sector is in meltdown, it is. There are other aspects of the Chinese economy. We don't want to underestimate the Chinese has multiple levers, and don't underestimate the Chinese economy. We hear a lot of Murdoch media bashing China. 8% electricity growth year on year is a huge number, and it's actually a massive sustainability challenge, because when you're getting that much electrification of everything, that much new electricity, you've got to build a absolutely huge amount of new capacity to do it. Now, I would say part of that is electrification of everything. So we're seeing EV sales in August, 54% of all new vehicle sales were new energy vehicles. So they're embracing the transition far faster than anyone probably gives them credit for. On a monthly basis, China is building 22 gigawatts a month of new zero emissions capacity, wind and solar. 22 gigawatts a month, that's up 21% year on year. And to put that in context, I think I've used those sort of numbers before in previous comments. We struggle to build 6 gigs a year, and China does that in a week. So for all that they are still building new coal-fired power plants, I think we need to put it in context. And for all that certain federal political parties are pushing a nuclear agenda, it's worth bearing in mind, year to date, China's built 180 gigawatts of wind and solar. They've built 1 gigawatt of nuclear. So on my basic maths, that's 180 to 1. America, it's only 44 to 1. But that's a little bit of nuclear with I would say a shitload of renewables, but in this context, we'll say a large amount of renewables. You get my point. Now, building on something Ilona mentioned, the ratcheting up of global climate ambitions, there's critical need for it. It's going to be a key theme of COP29. Murray mentioned that Minister Bowen's going to have a role in trying to drum more support for global capital flows, that we need trillions of dollars of finance mobilized to drive decarbonisation. We've actually at Climate Energy Finance put out a new report, which is called the Green Capital Tsunami. And what we've identified is that China, since the start of 2023, has invested well over $100 billion in outbound direct foreign investment just in the clean tech space. And I put that in the context in Australia. KPMG put out a report early this year saying 2023 was a multi-decade low for Chinese foreign investment into Australia in all areas. And that is obviously a clear reflection of increased geopolitical tensions in previous years. The good news is we are seeing the federal government make progressive progress in that. And we just saw last week the lobster ban from China has been lifted. $1 billion a year of lobsters now go back in. But that's happened in wine, it's happened in red meat, it's happened in coal, it's happened in barley. Bottom line, relationships are thawing and improving quite dramatically. Our report, we've identified 20 transactions worth a collective $8 billion Australian of clean tech investment in Australia. I'll finish by saying the AFR today's got a really good example of that. The Australian Financial Review reports a potential joint venture between China's Trina Solar and Australia's SunDrive to take advantage and access ARENA's Solar Sunshot initiative to build world-leading solar modules in Australia, but in partnership with the Chinese world leader. So a real opportunity for Australia to build tangible bridges with our number one trade partner and drive capital at the speed and scale. But if we don't do it, other countries are seizing that opportunity, and China's using it, in my view, as a massive geopolitical strategic pivot. It's a really good one. It's a race to the top. It's China helping Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Morocco, Turkey, Hungary, you name it, almost every country around the world to actually build capacity to deploy renewables. So a really important positive trend, and let's hope America and Europe respond by lifting their ambition as well.
Yeah. Well, let's now ask our guest speaker, Emma Dawson from Per Capita, to join us. And a big BCSDA welcome to you, Emma. Thank you for coming into the community of nerds and experts on ESG. And I wanted to sort of take some of the threads that we've heard from the others. And before I do, I need to do a logistics comment, which is, Tim, can you put a link of that report into the chat? And Murray, can you put a link to your podcast into the chat as well? Harking back to Emma. Emma, you've been a professional in this area for some considerable time, instrumental in relation to the work that Per Capita is doing. What's your observation around the interplay between economics and ESG at this present time? And what do you see are the important things that business needs to track in relation to this, that you're either giving advice, don't give detail, advice to clients, but what are the broad themes that business really does need to think about in this ESG space and the impact that it has on our economic circumstance?
A great question, Andrew, and a timely one, I think. I'd start by saying that I'm going to talk today about emphasising the S in ESG. I think in most developed nations now, many businesses are pretty conscious of the governance issues, particularly, and internally, a lot of work's gone on there. The environmental concerns obviously have been at the fore now for some time, and I think, all power to this group in particular, which has done a great job of driving that awareness through Australian business. But as we move hopefully permanently away from the era of questioning whether climate change and the action needed to address it is real, and more into the era of how we're going to do that, how we're going to adapt, mitigate the impacts, and take advantage of the opportunities that come with decarbonising, the social licence is becoming increasingly important. This is not a transition. This is effectively an industrial revolution that we're facing with transitioning our economy to a net zero status. And it is not one, for all that some on the left might wish it could be, not one that can be driven entirely by government. It is absolutely critical that our businesses, our private sector, take a lead in this space. But the political conflict around the need to make this transition to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy and to invest in and develop new industries and new forms of production that will be able to thrive in that net zero economy. Things like green steel, exporting renewable energies to our regions, becoming, as the government and so many in the sector want us to be, a renewable energy superpower, will require business to lead the way in many ways. So communicating with those regional communities in particular that are very concerned about the loss of their jobs, about the loss of their economic activity in regional centres, is going to be a task that needs to be undertaken by the private sector in partnership with government. That doesn't mean signing up to everything the government says or agreeing or never challenging government programs, but more about focusing on what your business is doing or what your particular sector is doing, not only to develop the best investments and approaches to maximise returns, to maximise shareholder profits, to ensure that your business is sustainable, but to ensure that you have the support of the communities that are coming along for the ride. There's a lot of fear, I think, particularly in regional rural areas that have traditionally relied on fossil fuel-based primary industries in their region, about what that transition will look like for them. And there is a growing level of distrust, you may have noticed, across society. We see it particularly in the US, but it's really across the developed world. We are seeing a much more highly polarized society on both right and left, that people are losing faith that governments, that big corporations, that the people that have their hands on the levers of our economy are concerned about them and their personal impact on them and their families. And so the idea of a social license to operate, of course, is something that's been thrown around in government circles for a long time. And there's a risk that if business isn't proactive in this space, engaging with people and talking about what the benefits are for them at a community and household level, as well as at a broader economic level, that the problems will be addressed through regulation rather than cooperation. So I do think the focus on the social is where we're right now.
Well, timely you say that, because today is the anniversary of the referendum on the voice to Parliament, which was unsuccessful by a majority of Australians and a majority of states, indicating that they were not supportive of the content of the proposal going forward into our constitution. I guess my question then is what does business do with that a year on in relation to the S agenda, and how does it play a substantive role where there is little appetite at this stage by government to enact the other three pillars of the Uluru Statement in relation to truth-telling and reconciliation? What can a responsible business do in relation to those aspects?
I think we need to see a devolution of the messaging and of our engagement from being what was perceived through the campaign for the voice as being quite a top-down, so-called elite approach. Business was great at getting on board with the campaign itself, but as we know, it failed. It failed very badly, and I think it's now a process of shifting from that national high-level messaging that a lot of people are starting to hear as, well, you think you know what's best for us, to more individual and targeted place-based engagement with people. Place-based can mean a number of things, whether that means it's the regional area in which you operate, but for your members, it's more likely to be, what place does your business occupy in the economic and social life of the country? So what is it that your business does that can be directly related to the advancements that we need to see? What are the unique understandings and knowledge and experience that your business might have from working with certain communities or for or on behalf of certain communities that you can bring to bear to what I think in future will need to be a much more organic grassroots approach to building that kind of support for social change and for social progress over time. And so it's about then looking inside and going, well, what's our particular expertise? Rather than, putting a flag in our email signatures or signing up to a campaign or signing an open letter in the newspaper, what do we have within our own people? We all have a diversity of people working in our organisations. So what might my people know that we haven't tapped into? What are the projects we've done that might have given us some insights that other organisations might not be naturally aware of? And And rather than signing up to a big program, trying to drive that from within your own organisation. So listening to staff, listening to customers, and listening to the impact that comes through at the end of every reporting period to say, well, has there been a shift here? Are we seeing consumer changes? Are we seeing customer engagement changes that might give us some insights that we can offer to a more nuanced process of engagement?
Yeah, your interesting comment about bringing it into the reporting. So the observation, or I guess the most profound element of Minister Plibersek's speech I found at the Global Nature Positive Summit was the reference to the incorporation of national data on climate, I think water and waste that will initially go into the budgetary assessment processes. And we also had the work chaired by now our Governor-General, Sam Mostyn, in relation to the incorporation of health and wellbeing elements and matters of gender. Is this, do you think, something that is its time has come for a country to actually incorporate non-traditional GDP factors into the way in which we calculate value and worth going forward? And if so, what does business do with that? Because historically it would just look at the numbers, it would understand debt, it would understand inflation. But if we're going to be having this plethora or at least a potential shopping list of other factors coming into financial and economic decision making, what does that mean for business into the future?
Really important conversation. And I think notwithstanding that we've got a US election coming up that could throw everything up in the air, there is a shift globally amongst governments of all stripes towards thinking differently about how we measure success, how we measure growth, how we measure well-being. But those measures aren't necessarily uneconomic measures. So there was quite a deliberate decision taken in the 1930s, for example, to leave out unpaid work, domestic labour, care labour from measures of GDP because it was seen as something that wasn't traded on the market, and so therefore it didn't have a market value. That in itself is problematic when one considers the extent to which our productive economic activity relies on those infrastructures of care that were provided at home. But even more so in the intervening almost century, as we've seen a lot of that work outsourced into the market economy through things like early education, childhood care and early childhood education and care, aged care, disability services, and so on. But also a lot of environmental activity that's remediating the damage done by inappropriate growth in certain parts. I think it needs to be seen not as a threat or not as an alternative to GDP and to those initial measures, but as a way of enhancing them. What's the purpose of growth after all? What's the purpose of economic activity? What's the purpose of the business we do? It's to improve our lives. Growth is just one way of doing that. So people's experience of the outcomes are really important. And when we look at the untapped potential, for example, of more women's workforce participation, of ensuring that those jobs that are essential to allow us to achieve outcomes across the economy are no longer underpaid and undervalued. It's about seeing this all as part of the well-being picture. But when we talk about well-being, it's not some airy-fairy, everybody feels nice, and really it's about getting people more time off. It's about ensuring that our families, our people, our working people, our children are not just producing being as meeting their potential, but that they're supported to do so. And so what we know now through a shift in recent years to incorporate more behavioural economics into our measurements and looking at how people respond is that the GDP structure, the classical economic structure, assumes rationality on the part of people. And we know that actually people make most of their decisions emotionally. That's really speak sometimes for, well, you're rational good, emotional bad, but when a family is making a decision about how many hours they can afford in the workforce, it's not just because they want to feel good about themselves, it's because they know they have to be there to look after their children. They have to feed them. They have to maintain that social and domestic infrastructure. So well-being is absolutely critical to productivity. If we're not healthy and well and feel supported, then we're much less likely to achieve our potential, both as individuals and as a country. So I think what individual businesses need to start doing, and what your organisation does so well, is dispelling that fear that it's one or the other. That if we're talking about other measures of well-being, of improved living standards, that has always been the goal of economic growth, is to improve living standards. They are in effect the same thing. It's just a more inclusive language, and it's a way of recognising that it's not just more money that makes people's lives better. It's how that money is, and how that income, how that productivity, how that wealth is used to improve our lives. And so business, I think, has a very important role to play in that space, not just to eliminate that fear, but to show that we understand our role is to improve the lives of our people.
Beautiful way to end. So thank you so much, Emma. And I would put an asterisk on that and say, let's talk again in the middle of next year, where the work of the Task Force on Inequality and Social Related Financial Disclosure starts to deliberate those very points that you've just been making. So very eager to see where that goes. Time doesn't allow us for a round table in relation to conversation consequences and Ilona's additional points that you wanted to make, which tends to suggest we should have made this an hour and a half, but we'll move on from that one. And thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget that a recording of this will be put up on our website. And I say it will be put up on our website because I have remembered to press the record button on this very occasion. If you haven't joined ESG Snapshot, please do so. And the contact details of those who have been speaking over the last year throughout ESG Quarter will be available to you in a separate email in a few days' time following this one. But big thank you to those, Tim, Ilona, Karen and Murray, for their contribution this year to ESG Quarter. It was a bit of an attempt to see if this was going to be of interest. We think it has been. We big thank you to our guest speakers over the last couple of months, including Emma and Lachlan Patterson from IGCC earlier in the year. Stay tuned to see the next iteration of ESG Quarter for 2025. Like Ilona, we will be watching uphill and down what happens at the COPs +1, because INC5 is not technically a COP, but you will see very soon in your inbox a invitation to a series the BCSD will be doing on all the various COPs, including during the COPs. And much to the chagrin of Murray Griffin, I will privately call it the G'day series. But for now, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrew Peterson, and stay safe and see you very soon somewhere, somehow. Bye for now.